unlock persistent rebels.
Today's guest is an aid worker. Could you explain why you're masked?
I was asked by the Citizen Rebel Project to come and talk about issues that relate to our work in the field. The point being that I could speak freely and not feel threatened about losing my job or potentially blowing a whistle on somebody.
What is it like for Westerners to find themselves in crisis countries? How do they interact with the local culture and population?
One of the first things that you learn as an aid worker is that you are arriving in a country with a particular perspective on what culture is. You have your own definitions of what culture are, and the host country population also does, but at the same time you're trying to be there to impart some kind of ideals upon the locals. So one of the major problems that you're confronted with as an aid worker is that once you get there, you realize that a lot of the ideas and behaviors in your own society that you were taught to think of as negative are actually represented by the local culture. For example, sexism, tribalism, ethnocentrism, these kind of traits that you may be taught depending on where you're from that are negative are suddenly in front of you while you're working, and you're having those kind of attitudes and behaviors projected on you. So it makes it rather difficult to be taught in your own country to view something as negative, volunteer or get paid to go help another society, and then realize that all the people you're interacting with represent all the negative isms in your society. So it can make it difficult. And as far as the difference between expatriates and locals go, if you have male-dominated society, maybe an Islamic society, you can't really have a Western woman in charge of the aid program, because that will immediately cause tensions and could, in the long term, just negatively impact the delivery of aid to the beneficiaries. So you want to be sensitive to the going back to the isms of other societies. Maybe they're sexist, but that is something that you have to take into account operationally, regardless of your feminist ideals.
So what is the role of the NGO in the field?
In general, if we're talking about NGOs, non-governmental organizations, the purpose is different for each organization. They have what are called mandates. So your mandate could involve helping people in a crisis situation. Your mandate could be about developing economies. That doesn't involve any war or civil strife. So it really depends what kind of organization you work for. My particular experience happens to be with emergency NGOs, and our goals generally tend to be about first needs. So if you have a major segment of a population fleeing one nation to another nation, we try to provide food, water, clothing, sometimes temporary shelter, maybe even transportation to an endpoint that takes the form of a refugee camp. So our role is not to take sides in any conflict or make any political pronouncements other than perhaps condemning the lack of response to a crisis. In that case, we're there to just help people who are fleeing from warfare in general.
What about the UN? What is its role in the field?
The United Nations provides slightly different services in some cases. They also have their emergency response organizations and mandates and post-conflict and development mandates. So if the United Nations has been invited as a peacekeeping mission, where they have the ability to use force to quell any sort of civil disturbance, or it's a different type of mission where they don't have that type of authority, then you have the UN providing sort of an infrastructure to help moderate the implementation of comprehensive peace agreements. There could be transitional governments that are involved in training and garnishing resources from the United Nations. So the United Nations role in that capacity tends to be more at macro level and less at the grassroots, on the ground level, where the NGOs sort of fill the needs there in a rapid manner. And sometimes the UN funds these NGOs. It just depends on which organization is working in which sector and who they want to get their money from.
We often hear that education is the first step to a better world. Do you believe that education is the key to conflict resolution in the developing world?
That's a good question also to ask of the developed world. If you look at the literacy rates of Europe in the 20s, the literacy rates of Eastern Europe in the 90s, you might ask yourself, well then how could a genocide have been perpetrated during World War II, and then how could the ethnic cleansing and the genocides have occurred in the 1990s if the literacy rate were in the 90th percentile? So I'm not sure that learning how to read and write is enough to be able to develop in any meaningful manner. I'm sure it's a necessary component at some level, but if we in the West, North America, or if we in the West, in Europe, can't seem to keep ourselves from killing other people who are different than us, then how are we supposed to expect poorer societies with fewer resources without a legacy of the Enlightenment to base any sort of progressive liberalism in?
How effective can a Western approach to negotiation be in conflict countries? Does it tend to help or hinder the intended beneficiaries?
Again, returning to the theme of this discussion is culture and in this case we're discussing culture and negotiation. One of the things that I learned myself as an aid worker is once I arrive in a location, I have my own goals, my own techniques, and my own ideas of how things should proceed. And I understand that I'm in another country that has goals and techniques of how they want to proceed, and that these goals and techniques may come into conflict, and they might not take us to a place where I, as an aid worker, want to ensure that beneficiaries receive whatever aid that it is I'm delivering. So the problem that I found myself into often is going into a negotiation expecting the local person to want to help the beneficiaries in the same way I wanted to help, when in fact a lot of the times it wasn't that this person wanted to participate in a humanitarian operation. This person wanted to be able to benefit economically from the situation and as a local power stakeholder. So already at the beginning, in terms of negotiation, I found myself unable to understand the person in front of me and why my products could sometimes not get out of the warehouse and why sometimes aid was diverted when I was trying to deal with the beneficiaries. And on the other side of the coin, my interlocutors could not understand why I wasn't giving them part of the medicine, the food, the shelter materials as a cost of doing business. And so what we find here are different ways of approaching a problem set with entirely different reasons. And at some point, if I were to take a naive approach and assume that the person sitting across the table from me shared the same goals and benefits and were to step out of a supervisory position, I would quickly find that my beneficiaries weren't receiving the aid, that aid is being diverted. And this is a problem that we run into in the field. When discussing how power works in another country, you might assume that because you represent an aid organization with a few $1 million worth of aid, that you have the power. But in fact, sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. In which case, the local power holders are the ones that control how your aid is delivered, whether it reaches the beneficiaries or not, what kind of problems you have. So you might have the military knocking on your door, for example, asking to look into your inventory to make sure that you're not smuggling drugs or weapons. Now you as a humanitarian aid worker, you might think, transparency. I have nothing to hide, so I'm going to let them look in my boxes even though they have no legal right, depending on the context, to do so. And lo and behold, During the search, they find drugs or weapons in your boxes, and that opens a can of worms, and so you have to pay people off, you have to somehow stop your operations, but to relaunch them. And what you learn out of this situation is not to allow them to look in the boxes at all. A local military commander told me the story about the ants, how they would nibble on your fingers and go away, and then come back a little while later and nibble on your entire hand, go away, and then come back and take your entire arm. The point of the story being, never let them nibble on your fingers to begin with. If you allow them to peer into the boxes and get closer into your operational standpoint, then there'll be more at stake in terms of goods, potential bribes, and that sort of thing. So it's better to set your boundaries immediately. The other thing that you find yourself doing is having what would be considered strange conversations from your perspective. For example, we were sent into Eastern Congo to open up an area for a nutritional program. The problem was the security status of the region was still considered to be risky. So once we went in there, we met with the local commander, the local chief of the village, and then some peasants around to find out that no one was planting because the soldiers were taking all of the food once it was harvested. Also, they were beating some of the men and raping some of the women. So from our perspective as aid workers, then we couldn't go into an area like that because the risk was too great. So I had to ask myself how I could gain access to this region to be able to treat the children and adults who are malnourished, but also to protect people from not becoming targets. So my conversation with this commander was to explain to him, look, you can tax the people, you can benefit, you can share some of the salaries with your soldiers, some of the food, some of the medicine, whatever it is that we bring in here, but you can't abuse the people and you can't take everything. Otherwise, we as in the international community can't come into this area and work. So here I am talking to a commander who has a record of ethnic cleansing and has definitely been terrorizing the populace, trying to explain to him that he needs to act as a functionary. He only needs to take a little bit and he can't harm the people. And once we can establish operations there, everyone can benefit. People can go back to their farms and plant, women can come in with their children to be fed, and then medical programs can come in once we've established that it's a safe area to be in. And that's kind of a strange conversation to have as a Westerner when you have been taught really not to tolerate that kind of behavior, and you're there to help somebody, so your expectation would be, well, let me help these people. Why are you getting in the way?
So what have you done to change your approach to negotiation, and who taught you?
I changed my approach once I found out that my worldview was inappropriate in that area and didn't serve the beneficiaries. If my true desire was to help the people, then my preconceived notions of how to negotiate, what humanitarian access is, needed to be placed on the side. And who else better to teach me how to negotiate in the local area than the locals themselves? So in a weird way, my teachers became the people that I would actually like to see in jail, because they were mostly ex-rebel soldiers, commanders, some of the government politicians who were all involved in the combat. And so for me in Africa, in conflict and post-conflict societies, I was taught by the Africans themselves how to negotiate regarding my goals in order to protect the delivery of aid to the beneficiaries. And that comes to such a point where I would not take a Westerner with me on some of these negotiations, because I would probably lose my job based on my behavior playing a strong hand when I could be next to somebody who would be thinking the same thing I thought at the beginning, that you need to be fair, it needs to be a win-win situation, I need to be respectful in the a manner that they felt was respectful and not in local terms. So I've changed a lot in my negotiation approach, and I basically change it according to the host culture where I find myself, and I learn from the locals.
Could you explain the concept of otherness and the politics of recognition?
What I mean by otherness is how you perceive yourself when you look in the mirror. Do you see yourself? Meaning, do you see yourself as a human, as someone who interacts with family members, with other social beings? Or do you see something else that doesn't reflect any connection to your family and social relations? So the point is really to get people to look into the mirror and see themselves in you as a foreigner so that you are humanized in that moment. And once you are humanized, then the politics of recognition shift from an adversarial standpoint to more of a kinship standpoint. You're different, but you're human, and how can I interact?